Hi, Ardena. Can
Hi,
you hear
how are
me?
you? Yes, I can hear
Good.
you.
How are you?
Good.
Good. I don't think I've ever seen your face before.
Oh, okay.
Know your voice
you
from the
seen it?
podcast. I've emailed with you. I've talked with you on the phone.
Oh, that's funny.
But it
Okay.
occurred to me, I don't know what she looks
You
like.
don't know my face. I hope it matches up to the voice anyhow. That's funny.
I didn't really have anything in my head. What I actually
Right.
realized
No,
is
no,
I
I'm
don't have
joking.
anything in my head to go with it.
I was joking around. I was joking around.
So, all right. Well, we're so glad you're doing this for us and so honored, really.
Thank you. No, it was a lot of fun. I did it once before and I had a great time. So happy to be
Awesome.
here again.
Yeah, they're an enthusiastic crowd.
Yes.
So, all right. Well, you know what? I hate keeping people waiting. So, if you're
Yeah,
ready,
go
I
ahead.
think
We
I
can
will
get
just,
straight
I
to
will
it.
bring
Yeah.
everybody
Is
in.
it okay if I share my screen? Because I'm gonna
Yes. Is there something I need to do so you can share your screen?
I think you have to make me a co-host.
All right. How do
Click
I
on
do
my
that?
name.
So, oh, okay. Under joined. Okay. Click
Yeah.
on your name more.
And hit more, and then it should have like make co-host or something.
Okay. There we go. How's that?
Perfect.
All right. All right. I'm going to bring folks in then. Here we go. All right. Just going to give everybody a few minutes to pour in from the waiting room, and then we will get started. Okay. All right. I think there's no one in the waiting room. Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning and a Daily Dose of Talmud, and welcome to our weekly Daf Yomi review class. This week, we are so lucky to be taught by Dr. Yardena Osmond, who is not only a pediatrician, but also the host of an amazing Daf Yomi podcast that I enjoy listening to. And you guys have learned with her before, and we're so excited to have you back. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Nice to see some people that I've learned with before, especially I see Erica Goldman Brody from my old stomping grounds of Riverdale. Please feel free to put into the chat where you're learning with us today. One of the things I love about doing Zoom is sort of seeing how we can all learn together really from around the world now, which is just amazing. So we are going to try to squeeze into a summary of the first, I would say, Daf Bet through Tet of Moed Katan. We may not get to Tet, so but it's a good piece of Gemara there. And I think one thing, just a couple of introductory
Dr.
words.
Osmond, what numbers are Bet and Tet?
Oh,
you translate those for us?
2 and 9. Sorry, 2 and 9. I will make sure to use English. So Moed Katan is an interesting tractate because it basically deals with all the laws of Chol HaMoed, those intermediate days that we have on Sukkot and on Pesach, that are not exactly a Chag, they're not exactly a Yom Tov or a holiday where all work is not permitted other than what we need to eat. But it's still a day that's special enough that we're not really allowed to just do anything that we want to do. And so I think in terms of putting it into a context of Seder Moed, right, that is, we know that the Mishnah is divided into 6 larger books. And so Moed Katan appears in the second Seder, which is the one of Moed, which deals with all the holidays. You really need to look at Moed Katan sort of on a spectrum of, you have Shabbat, which deals with all of the laws of Shabbat, Beitza, which deals with all the laws of Chag itself, of Yom Tov itself, right, of those holidays of Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, and then you have Moed Katan, which is the Chol Hamoed days, which we only have on Sukkot and on Pesach. And so therefore, we need to think about sort of that as a spectrum of like what's allowed on Shabbat, what's allowed on Yom Tov, which we see in Beta, and what's allowed in Moed Katan. And I think when we think about it that way, I'm going to share my screen to share with you some of the text here. So, there's no judgment on the number of tabs. Okay. So that's why I feel like we're family. You can see my tab obsession. Okay. So, the Gemara at least begins with the first Mishnah, which is a very interesting Mishnah. There's kind of no introduction, and it sort of just throws us straight into Moed Katan. Mashkin beit hashlachin b'moed ubashvit beimi ma'ayan sheyatza b'tchila beimi ma'ayan shelo yatza b'tchila. So the first law it wants to tell us about Chol Hamoed is one can irrigate a field that requires irrigation on these intermediate days, right? That's the English translation you also find for it, as well as on Shvit. So I always love when we're learning something that has to do with things that we're experiencing now. So I'm teaching to you from Israel. I live in Modi'in. And my father, Zichrono Livracha, would always call these like a Nes Nistar. So we're in a Shemitah year. So that's what Shvit is referring to there, right? So you are allowed to irrigate a field that needs irrigation on these intermediate days, on Chol Hamoed, and also on Shvit, on a Shemitah year, both from a newly emerged spring, right, that only began to flow during the day before in the festival itself, and from a spring that did not just emerge, has been flowing from some time. Aval ein mashkin lo mimei hagshamim v'lo mimei hakilon. But we cannot irrigate a field with rainwater that was collected in a cistern. And the reason for that is it requires a lot of work to get the rain out of the water. And we want to, a lot of what's going on in Moed Katan is we can do certain activities, but we don't want them to be things that require so much work that we sort of can't do them. It's too much effort sort of for Chol Hamoed. Below mimein hakilon, and also we can't, or water that was drawn from a kilon, which was like a lever that was used to raise the bucket up. So very interesting first Mishnah. And so the first page of the Gemara is, and I'm not even reading the entire Mishnah here because I want to get onto some other things. The rest of the Mishnah deals with constructing ditches. And I think what's interesting about this is, one, from a historical perspective, I think it's interesting to see what were the things that took up people's time there, right? Like if we had to think about after we've taken off a day or 2 days, if we're in the diaspora of Chag, where we're sort of not doing anything, and then we get to that first day of Chol Hamoed, where we're like, oh, there's a couple things in my life, I can't completely dedicate myself only to it being a holiday. There's a few things in my life that I really have to take care of, right? So I guess share in the chat, in our modern world, what would those things be, right? I don't think for most of us, they would be irrigating a field. And so I think the first thing that we learn here is sort of, what was life like in the time in the Mishnah? And that obviously they're starting with an example that probably had a lot of relevance for a lot of people, right? It was an agricultural society. And so this is the type of thing that people were worried about, right? You would wake up after one day of Chag. Maybe it was, think about Pesach. It could have been a very warm Pesach that year. Let's say you're living in Israel, or it could have been Sukkot and it hasn't rained yet at all, right? The whole summer. And so the farmer is worried that his, land is getting a little dried out, and therefore he needs to water it. And so I think we can learn a lot from this. One of the things I've been thinking about throughout my learning of Moed Katan is sort of what would the modern version of that look like? So if anybody, I'm just going to quick see oh, thank you, Rob, no tab shaming. So if anybody has any ideas of sort of what their modern version of what you think the first Mishnah in 2022 would start with, I would love to hear some ideas about that. So that sort of sets us up. Now, the other thing that's interesting about Moed Katan is has to do with the Talmud Bavli in general. So I mentioned before that there are 6 seders of Mishnah. The first one is a seder called Zra'im, which literally means seeds and basically deals with all agricultural law. It starts, the first Masachet is Brachot, which deals with blessings and prayers, but the rest of them deal with all agricultural law, like things like Shemitah, that's Masachet Shvi'it, Masrot, right? How do we give Maser appropriately? Anything that has to do with anything with agriculture. The Talmud Bavli did not write on this. There's no Talmud Bavli on Seder Zra'im, and the reason is because most of those laws really only applied to people who were living in Israel, right? Many, we don't do Shemitah outside of Israel, right? And Maser, right? The giving of the tithes to the priests and to the Levium was not something we do outside of Israel. And therefore, if you're an Amora living in Bavel, it's not particularly relevant. And so therefore, we have to look to sort of the hidden passages that will appear in the Talmud Bavli that are not directly under a Masachet from Seder Zraim, right? The Yerushalmi does have all of this as part of its Gemara, right? But we have to find that here. And so what's interesting is in the first couple pages of Moed Katan, we do find that there's a rather lengthy discussion about Shemitah, and there's a rather lengthy discussion about Kilayim, about the law that forbids us from planting what we call in English would be diverse kinds, right? But the idea is that you can't plant two different types of seeds together. And so that's another thing that I think is really unique about Moed Katan is we have a lot of agricultural law, at least in the beginning of it. One thing that I want to pay attention to about that agricultural law is found on page 3b. So we'll just skip down to there. And it gets into a whole discussion about Shemitah, right? This sabbatical year that we're in the middle of keeping now. And one of the things it talks about is when does the year of Shemitah actually begin? In other words, does it just begin on Rosh Hashanah, right? In other words, that's the seventh year of sort of what we call our Shemitah cycle. So it's that last year. And does it begin sort of on Rosh Hashanah, or are there activities that are already prohibited to do, that were prohibited to do even before technically the Shemitah year actually starts? And so the Gemara basically teaches us that, yes, there actually are activities that are prohibited even before that. This is not good. That might be, oh, there we go. Okay. So there are things that are prohibited even to do beforehand. And so I'm just going to read this passage here. But Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, Yamim shehosifu chachamim lifnei Rosh Hashanah, right? That there was an addition made. There were extra days that were added by the sages before Rosh Hashanah. Okay. V'hachi ka'amar. And this is what they were saying. Okay. Yachol yilakeh al tosefet Rosh Hashanah, right? One might have thought that you would be flogged, basically that you would receive lashes, right, for working the land on that additional time period. Right? And they learned this from a particular verse in Shemot, Exodus chapter 34, verse 21. But rather, right, this teaching teaches us that you actually don't get lashes. Now, I don't want to focus on the lash piece, but what's interesting is that what Rabbi Yochanan is teaching us is, and I sort of start in the middle of the passage, is that there is an idea here that we add on extra time, right? And so then the Gemara says, Ma yamim shelifnei Rosh Hashanah. What are those extra days? Kiditnan. And so now they quote a Mishnah from Masachet Shvit, which again is one of those Masachtot in Seder Zraim that there's no Talmud Bavli on. And this is the first Mishnah in the entire Masachet. And this is a Masachet that deals with all the laws of Shemitah, right? Ad matai chorshim b'stei ilan erev Shvit. Until when can somebody plow an orchard on the eve of the sabbatical year? Meaning on year 6, okay? Is there a time where you have to stop plowing your orchard? Beit Shammai amrim alzman sheyafel lepri. Right, so Beit Shammai says it's so long as it's beneficial to the fruit, meaning it's going to help the trees that already have the 6-year fruit on it. Okay, Ubeit Hillel omrim ad atzeret until Shavuot, and then the Mishnah makes a comment ukrovin divrei elu lihiot k'divrei elu, that actually in practice there's not really a big difference between the two dates. But if you really think about it, the time difference between when Shavuot is and when the next Rosh Hashanah is, I mean, that's months, right? So that's telling us that there was a special law made that sort of prohibited, anything being done months before Shemitah actually started on your orchards. And then the Gemara says, "V'ad matai chorshin stei halavan erev Shvit," right? When can somebody? This is another Mishnah in Shvit, right? When can someone plow a white field, which means a grain field? Misha tzachala halecha. You can plow it until there's sort of this residual moisture from the rain ceases, so long as people continue to plow their fields to plant cucumbers and gourds, which are always planted at the end of the winter. Again, this is not plowing your fields way before Shemitah actually starts. All right, and then Rabbi Shimon comes and says, right, Rabbi Shimon Omer, so Rabbi Shimon says, if there was really no set time here, then the Torah basically gave each individual a measure in the individual of each person. So in other words, he's saying this is a little bit too vague. Anybody could sort of decide when they don't want to plant. Ella b'stei havan ad Pesach, so he makes firm rules, right? A grain field you can plow until Pesach. Ubistei ha'ilan, an orchard ad hadseret. Ubeit Hillel omrim ad Pesach, and then Beit Hillel says until Pesach. So again, just to emphasize, there's a very, very long period of time that you were not plowing before the Shemitah year actually started. And then we have a very, very interesting statement here. But I'm a Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, I'm a Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Mishum bar Kapra. So Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi says in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, in the name of bar Kappa, Rabban Gamliel ubeit dino nimnu al shnei prakim halalu ubitlum. That what happens, Rabban Gamliel in his courts, remember we have Rabban Gamliel, this is referring to Rabban Gamliel II, okay, who comes after Shammai and Hillel, right? He's in Yavna. This is when sort of the center of Judaism is taken away from Yerushalayim, and now we are in Yavna. That's where the Beit Midrash is. And he basically says they voted about these two periods, the Passover from the Pesach from Shavuot until Rosh Hashanah, and nullified them. And they said they don't apply anymore. The Gemara cannot understand this. So I don't have time to read this whole piece, and I encourage all of you to read it. I more set up the question. But what follows is a fascinating discussion about sort of how is law determined. And basically what the Gemara tries to say is, first it says, how could Rabban Gamliel undo something that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel did, right? If we think about the period of time that all these people lived, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel are the end of a period of time called the Zugot, the pairs, okay? This is before the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. And then sort of, right, and at the end of their era, sort of the beginning of the Tanaim, right? One of Hillel's students is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And then you get to Rabban Gamliel, who's post-Second Temple, and he's allowed to say that, we were allowed to be mivatel, we're allowed to nullify something that they said. The Gemara goes even farther. Then the Gemara says, actually, this was the Halacha LaMoshe Misinai, right? That this was the law that was handed down to Moshe that's not written in the Torah, but it's part of our, what we call our Masorah. It's just part of our tradition. And again, the Gemara is going to ask the question, how is it possible that Rabban Gamliel is allowed to nullify that, okay? And then finally, it's going to say, no, it's not even a Halacha LaMoshe Misinai. Then they bring some verses to prove maybe it's actually written explicitly in the Torah itself. And they try to say, so, they're trying to they keep like upping the ante, right? Like it's bad enough Rabban Gamliel tried to, nullify something Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel said. It's bad enough he tried to maybe nullify something that is Halacha LaMoshe Misinai. Then maybe he's actually nullifying that something that was actually written Torah itself. And so we see this very interesting discussion that really the meta discussion there is about like, how is halacha actually decided? And what are later generations actually allowed to do? And are they allowed to decide something that may presumably even go against something that is explicitly written in the Torah itself? And so the Gemara, I skipped a big chunk of this. So now we're on Daf Daled, we're on page 4, and sort of at the conclusion of all of this, and there's a whole machlokas with Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael in part of this. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabban Gamliel, ubeit dino midoraito batul kol. So think about where this goes. Rabbi Yochanan says, right, that Rabban Gamliel and his court were able to nullify this, what based on a written source. So in other words, after all this discussion, here comes Rabbi Yochanan, right, who's a first generation Amora who's living in Israel, and he says, okay, he says, yes, he did nullify, but it was because it was based on a verse. So once he can base it on a verse, then it becomes equal to something that's deoraita. And so what's the reason, right? So it says my taima, and they make something that's called a gezerah shava. What a gezerah shava is you take the context of a word in one place and you apply that context to the word in another place. And here the gezerah shava is on the word Shabbat, right? We know that Shemitah is described as a Shabbat. It's a year of rest for the land. And so they compare it to the Shabbat of the Shabbat of Bereshit, the first Shabbat that was ever in the world, right? Just as with a regular Shabbat, the day before and the day after, you're allowed to do work, right? On Friday and Sunday, do we do work during the week? Yeah, of course we do work. Here also, okay, the day before and the year before and the year after, we're allowed to do work. And therefore, according to Rabban Gamliel, using this gezerah shava, Shemitah only has to start exactly on the Rana of the 7th year. Now Rav Ashi comes and he basically wants to say, right? Matkif la Ravashi, Manta Amar Hilchata, right? This one who says this halacha, Ata Gezerah Shava Akra Hilchata. Are we allowed to say that a Gezerah Shava can undo, this method of Gezerah Shava can undo a halacha that's like a halacha l'Moshe Sinai? Umanda Amar Kra, and the one who said that this halacha of extending the Shemitah year was based on an actual Torah verse, Ata Gezerah Shava Akra Kra. Are they really allowed to undo this just with this technique of Gezerah Shava? Ella Amar Ravashi. So Rav Ashi concludes, Rabban Gamliel Ubeito Ubeitino Svira Lake Rabbi Yishmael. So they hold actually like Rabbi Yishmael, right? To Amar Hilchata Gimri Lahu, who said that this halacha of extending the Shemitah year was actually halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's a Masorah. V'ki Gimri Hilchata Bizman Shebeit Hamikdash Kayam. And there was a caveat to this halacha, that this halacha only applied at a time when the Beit HaMikdash was standing. Dumiyah de Nisuch HaMayim, like the mitzvah of Nisuch HaMayim. That was the water libation, which was part of the service of the temple, which obviously only could be done during the time of the temple. Aval Bizman she'ein Beit HaMikdash Kayam lo. But when the temple is not standing, this halacha would no longer apply, and therefore Rabban Gamliel was allowed to nullify it. Now, I think this is an amazing piece of Gemara. Besides teaching us a lot about Shemitah, it teaches us a lot also about how the development of halacha. And I think one of the things that we see that the Beit Midrash, the Beit Din of Rabban Gamliel is dealing with is trying to figure out what is halacha going to look like in a post-temple world, right? And so we see the tension on the page of the Gemara. On the one hand, no one's saying that what Rabban Gamliel did was wrong. Like no one, questions it or says what he taught wasn't followed. But on the other hand, the Gemara started saying, hold on a second here. We have something that may actually be able to be a deoraisa, meaning it's actually from the verses of the Torah itself. And along comes Rabban Gamliel, and he's going to be allowed to reverse it. And so the caveat that has to exist in order for that nullification to take place is it has to be pre-temple versus post-temple. And I think the Gemara here is saying something very, very deep about that, because it's really telling us sort of the creativity, or let's say the flexibility that was allowed in halacha once the temple was destroyed. Okay. And I think this tells us a lot also about how halacha in general is supposed to sort of develop from generation to generation, right? The Gemara here is basically saying this halacha could not be stagnant. It was not possible for it to actually be stagnant. And I think that's a very fascinating and, sort of meta discussion that the Gemara wants to have here. Okay, now let's move on to page 5. So on page 5, we have a new Mishnah that has a discussion here about other activities that we can or cannot do on Chol Hamoed. And one of the things that it says that we are allowed to do is that we can actually mark graves. And I think for people reading this or learning this in the year 2022, when we think of marking graves, right, what is it that we think about? We basically think about it's like putting a headstone up, right? Like marking it with some type of matzeva where we say something nice about a person and something like that. And really, if you actually read the Gemara itself, it's the marking of graves was actually something that was totally different. And what's interesting also is that the Mishnah that it comes in, sorry, I'm just having trouble finding my place here. Okay. Is that the Mishnah talks about, it lists a bunch of things that you're allowed to do. You're allowed to prepare, fix cisterns. You can prepare roads, fix roads. Like there's other things for the public good that you can do. And one of the things list there is mitzanin et hakvarot. You can mark the graves. And the reason for the marking the graves is actually has nothing to do with someone's personal connection with the person who may have died there, but it was a much more practical thing. Remember that in the earlier days, especially when the temple existed, whether you became tameh, whether you became, I don't love the English translation, impure from coming in contact with a dead body was a source of great concern for people, right? Particularly Kohanim, the priests who had to work there, or if you were an individual who just needed to go up to the temple for whatever reason and have some service performed on your behalf. And therefore, they wanted to make sure this was a public goods. This is part of public works, that part of the public works in Eretz Yisrael was to be mitzanin et hakvarot, was to make sure that we had to mark the graves correctly. And so I think this really shifts a little bit, in terms of thinking about like how we commemorate our dead, right? For us, the process of marking a grave. It's much more about commemoration and much more about memory. And in the times of the Gemara, the times of the Mishnah, what they're recording has nothing to do with memory. This isn't a emotional activity, right? What this has to do with it's a practical halacha piece. And it's interesting to see that it's really part of sort of the public good. Like this is just sort of the same way that you had to make sure the roads were, that there wasn't a major road that fell out of disrepair. So this is also something that the public always needed to be aware of, right? The public needed to know, so they would know where to avoid contracting tuma. And I just think it's like it shows us sort of how much issues of tuma and tara were really part of everyday life. The same way that agriculture, we started off by saying, was part of day-to-day life. Tuma and tara was part of day-to-day life in a way that was not for us at all. Okay, we got a couple more minutes. Okay, on Daf Vav, on 6, we have a very, very interesting discussion about the law of kilayim. And what we learn here, that's the mixing of diverse kinds of diverse seeds, right? Where if you planted a field that had a multitude of or different types of seeds, that was a problem. I'm not going to read this part inside, but I think it gives us a really interesting sort of discussion about what the process of kilayim was. I've learned the Masechet of kilayim many, many times. And I think I always thought of it as sort of like, I don't know, for whatever reason, people preferred to plant things mixed. And actually, someone who listens to my podcast actually sent me a very interesting article that apparently I'm not a gardener at all. And maybe some of you know this, that there actually is a concept in gardening or in planting that sometimes we purposefully plant certain species together. I see a few of you nodding because there's certain properties of different species. Like in other words, one species is known to repel certain insects. So it sort of ends up protecting another species that you would plant with. So apparently this is actually a farming technique. This is something I did not know before. But what's clear from when you read Daf Vav, when you read page 6, is that the kilayim that they're discussing there is actually sort of a kilayim that sort of like happens by mistake, right? It's not necessarily kilayim that was sort of done on purpose. However, right, it was the owner of the field's responsibility to remove the kilayim. And so basically what the Gemara discusses here is that on at some point during Adar, and it has a discussion, it may have happened during other times during the year as well, the Beit Din, the court, would actually appoint emissaries to go out to the field, give the people warning, and inspect the fields, right? And initially what would happen is that people would, the Beit Din would come, the emissaries would come, they would hire workers, and they would literally weed out the kilayim. And then they would take that kilayim and they would feed it to the owner's animals. And so the Gemara describes the owners were thrilled that this happened, right? Why? Because it means the hired laborers of the Beit Din weeded their fields for them, right? So they got free labor and fed their animals for them. So this actually ended up being sort of like a win-win for the farmers. So there actually was sort of no there was no incentive essentially for anybody to actually not have kilayim there, right? So then what the Gemara then describes that basically what would happen after that is, so then they said, okay, we're not going to feed the animals anymore. We're sort of going to just throw the food onto the wayside, but the Beit Din would still come and would still take out would weed out the kilayim. And again, it says, okay, but the people were happy because at least then, right? At least their field, it's on page B of 6 here. I just found it here, right? Then at least then they were happy because then at least then, their field still got weeded out, okay? And so then finally it says here, so finally, what did the Beit Din have to do? They had to say that actually they would declare these fields ownerless. So in other words, it had to be, and that, which means what? Anybody's allowed to come and take anything they want from that field. The owner sort of lost their right to have anything to do with that field if they didn't take care of their kilayim again. So to me, this was an interesting piece because first of all, I think it teaches us something about kilayim, which again, I'm not a gardener, so or a farmer, so it taught me something interesting, the way that I think sort of kilayim just happens by accident, and we could see it seeds blow, things get misplanted or things like that. And this probably would just happen. Or maybe this was a technique that sometimes farmers preferred to use, and it was up to the Beit Din to make sure that it wasn't being done. But second, I think we see something very interesting about human nature here, right? Like the Beit Din initially sort of tries to help the farmers, right? To be like, okay, we'll help you get rid of the kilayim. And then they realize this did not de-incentivize them. In fact, it's described as simcha, gidolah, that the farmers were actually very happy to have the Beit Din do this for them. And then finally, they have to make this takana overall that essentially it's the owner's actual responsibility. Okay, I only got to page 6. So page 7 has a great discussion about sarad, whether or not the Kohen is allowed to actually check the skin for leprosy, which is interesting and gets into a great discussion about happiness on Chol HaMoed, that the reason why we don't want to declare somebody as having leprosy is because it's not a happy thing to have happen to you on Chol HaMoed. And so from there, and 7 and 8, there's some very great discussions about the concept of simcha on Chol HaMoed, the idea of ein marvin simcha b'simcha, that we don't do two things of happiness. And that's where we get the law on page 8, that we're not allowed to have a marriage take place on Chol HaMoed. So just pay attention to that also. There's really some great content about what does joy actually mean. And I think what it's really trying to teach us is to sometimes to appreciate the moment of joy that you are actually in and not to combine it with other things. So there's a special joy of Chol HaMoed that we shouldn't combine with other types of joy. So I know that we went a little bit over. I'm just going to go, yes, it's called companion planting. Thank you. I couldn't remember what it was actually called. Okay, Josh Tucker, I wonder if this is the same Rabban Gamliel as the writers of the Christian's Book of Acts, positive thought of Paul of Tarshish. Yes, there is a whole theory on that, which is well beyond our class today. So, but that is something, so there's some theories about what Rabban Gamliel's role was exactly, maybe in early Christianity. Okay, and then there's companion planting. Yes, that's what it is. So basil and tomatoes, I'm learning lots of things. French marigolds and tomatoes. Okay. French marigolds repel bad root rot, nematodes. I didn't know that if I said that correctly. Not a complete cure, but helps reduce intensity of damage. Yes, so that's exactly what it is. So thank you to all the gardeners who share that wonderful wisdom with us. So with that, that is my half-hour Daf Yomi recap. Next time I do this, maybe I'll start with the end of the week so that we end up getting to it. I'm happy to take any questions. Yes, everybody stay healthy, safe, and it was great learning with you all. Thank you.
Dr. Osmond, thank you so much for steering us around not only the material, but some of the more theoretical issues that it raised. You really did that masterfully in just half an hour. Let me see. Have I forced everybody to mute? Let me see if I can. I will let everybody unmute themselves now, in case anybody has any questions. I saw a lot of people mouthing thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I don't hear any sound though. So, okay, I did allow participants to unmute themselves.
I'll just great job. Thank you. And I'll just say playfully, I too am not a farmer and I struggle with the first couple pages. So if we can have a co-teacher of someone who knows irrigation expertise to do a summary of that, because I had to gloss over that because I really struggled with that stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that stuff is very, very challenging and very, very different. Okay.
I have a question.
Someone is raising their hands there. Yes.
Hi, I have a question. How did the rabbis determine which areas of halacha they could change after the temple? Because that's an easy excuse. If you don't like something, you can say, oh, well, it only applied then. Did they have any rules for that?
Yeah, there's not really any rules that are written in the Gemara where it says if it follows this or follows that. I think the most famous of that is we know in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right, who is the one who gave up Jerusalem, right? That's that famous story. And he says, Tain li Yavna v'chachmao. So he makes the difficult decision to essentially move the center of Judaism to a Beit Midrash in Yavna outside of Yerushalayim. He's also famous for making 9 takanot. He makes 9 decrees which really change how Judaism is practiced. For example, Lulav was only taken when the Beit HaMikdash stood. Lulav was done every day in the Beit HaMikdash over Sukkot, but in the rest of the country, it was only done on day one. And he makes a takana that says it needs to be done for all 7 days outside of the Beit HaMikdash. So in other words, I think the thing that you could, maybe the overarching principle, and I'm sure someone's written a dissertation on this or there's a book on it, is that it somehow has to preserve some type of continuity with Judaism, right? Think about what Sukkot would look like if you were not taking lulav every day, right? And they write about, is it a zecher lemigdash? Like, it's not necessarily that you're fulfilling a mitzvah, that you're accomplishing something that you're supposed to do, but it's there because we want to remind you what the holiday was actually supposed to look like. And that's not the only reason why he made some of those takanot. So I think that's a good place to start. You could just Google like the 9 edicts, the 9 takanot of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And I think that'll give you that's a good starting place to start thinking about this.
Thank you.
My question is, you asked the question, in today's world, what would be the first Mishnah if you were writing it?
Yes, I don't have an answer. I haven't come up with that yet. I don't know if you do yet. I'm still thinking about it.
Someone said something about masks in the comments.
Oh, maybe. I'm trying to think what's something in your business or something that you would sort of have to attend to right away. I mean, I guess checking your email, I don't know, checking your work email, right? Something like that. I think what it also shows us is how few of us really do physical labor as part of our work today, at least in my circle,
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Dr. Osmond, for leading such an invigorating class. And yeah, we'll see you all next time.
Okay. Hope to learn with you all soon. Stay healthy and safe, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye,
Thank you
everybody.
so much.
Bye.
Packed. Thank you. Thank you.